Nature Here show. I'm your host, Heather Asa, and this is our guest speaker, John Rakestraw. Welcome, John, and we're going to be talking about shorebirds today.
Yes, thank you.
What are some important things about shorebirds? What's the most thing that we probably need to know about shorebirds?
Well, what is a shorebird,
exactly.
for example? Shorebirds are a large group of birds. There are about 215 of them in the world. Generally long-legged, slender bills. They feed along the edge of the water, sometimes wading in, sometimes not. Known for their long migration. They're very strong flyers.
Okay. Do they swim?
Some will swim. Some will wade up to their belly. Some will actually swim in the water.
Great.
There are a few shorebirds that actually spend the winter out at sea.
Okay. And why are they the world's greatest migrants?
Incredible long-distance migrations by a few species. There's one species, the bar-tailed godwit, which will leave the western coast of Alaska and fly non-stop to New Zealand. It takes several days, but they just keep going.
So they stock up on food, or they get ready for the flight.
Right.
I mean, that's a long
It's
flight.
a long haul. Many shorebirds will congregate in what are known as staging areas, places where there's lots of food, a safe place to hang out. They'll feed there for days or weeks, build up a big layer of fat, and then they'll take off and they'll survive on that fat as they're flying.
Nice. And do they fly in large groups, or do they just stay with their own specific species, or do they go together?
Most shorebirds will flock with their own kind. You'll see mixed flocks as well, but ranging anywhere from a few birds to thousands of birds at a time. There's safety in numbers, so you don't often see shorebirds by themselves.
Nice. And they fly along the coastlines, or they actually go over the coast, or just...
Many shorebirds will
depends.
follow the coastlines or over the central part of the continent as well. But some will actually fly over the ocean.
Nice. And the food, is there a specific kind of food that they eat, or they all eat different things, or...
Different species eat different things.
Okay.
They're all looking for small aquatic creatures, little aquatic invertebrates, worms, crustaceans, insect larvae. A few of the larger shorebirds will eat small fish. I saw one eating a frog once.
Oh, that's quite big for a bird to be eating
Yes.
a frog. That's awesome. Okay, and if, the shorebirds, what's a basic one that people, they would recognize most, or they would probably see that's the most common, that somebody'd say, oh, I didn't realize that was a shorebird, and they've seen it?
Right, a very common species around the Portland area is the killdeer. You see them along edges of the water, but you'll also see them in grassy areas like soccer fields or football fields. They're fairly large for a shorebird, brown on top, white underneath with two black bands across the breast, so they're very easy to recognize.
So it'd be something like a sandpiper? Something they'd see, or no?
Yeah,
Or...
sandpipers are a type of shorebird, as are plovers. Plovers, like killdeer, tend to be rather plump with shorter bills. Sandpipers tend to be longer legged and longer billed. There are lots of different groups of shorebirds.
Okay, but that's something people probably see more common if they were in a soccer field or out someplace where there's a wetlands, where they might have seen, oh, hey, I think I've seen one of those before.
Exactly,
That would be something.
exactly. And they're very vocal too. They call a lot, so they're pretty easy to recognize from that.
How many different species of birds do you think that there are?
Shorebirds are about 215 in the world. Of those, 58 have been seen in Oregon at one time or another. On a given day, if you go out during the peak of migration, with some luck, you can see about 12 species in a day.
250, that's a lot of birds. And you say that they don't all flock together, there's species they kind of stick to their own?
Oftentimes the shorebirds will stick with their own species, but it's not uncommon, especially during migration, to see mixed flocks of different species flying together.
Okay, so along the coastline, if you're at the beach and you're, where the water's a little bit more shallow, you're going to tend to see them?
Yes, along the coastline, tidal pools, river estuaries where the rivers come into the ocean, those are often very good spots. Inland, wetland areas, like in the video we're going to see shortly, pond edges, and sometimes just wet fields, like soccer fields.
Okay, and are most birds, when you go to approach them, they fly off and are they similar to that too? If you were to see a bird and approach it, you got pretty close to it, if someone was interested, then would they be the same way they would?
They often tend to be rather shy, but with any bird, if you're quiet and stand still for periods of time, the birds will actually come quite close. When the habitat is good and they're busy feeding, sometimes you can get very close to these birds. Okay,
and are the populations of them really large?
For some species, you can see flocks of several thousand at a time. Western Sandpiper in Oregon is a good example. If you're in Oregon and you see a couple thousand small shorebirds going by, chances are they're Western Sandpipers. Dunlin is another species that you can see very large flocks of. Other birds like least Sandpipers, you might see a dozen at a time, but you never see huge flocks of them.
Okay, and are they getting larger in numbers? Are they getting smaller? What affects them? What makes them in there?
The thing that affects shorebird populations most is their habitat, not only on their nesting and wintering grounds, but also where they migrate. Because they undertake such long migrations, they need places where they can stop and rest and build up fat reserves for their migration. So if those areas are disturbed or destroyed, then the population suffers. Even if their nesting grounds are doing fine, if there's no place to rest along their migration, they can weaken and die from that.
And what about like diseases or anything? Is there anything that like seems to attack them more, or some kind of a predator or something that they tend to tend to go towards them
Yeah,
more?
the main predators of shorebirds would be birds of prey, falcons, like peregrine falcons and merlins. As far as land-based predators, there aren't that many. Shorebirds are very quick. Disease can be a problem sometimes in the late summer. There'll be outbreaks of avian botulism. This happened at Smith and Bybee Lakes here in Portland a few years ago, where water levels get low and a lot of bacteria build up in the water. And
stagnant, so it tends to cause bacteria. Which
right, so there can be some disease outbreaks in that regard.
Okay. And when, like if we go to an area and they're watching them or whatnot, is there certain things that they should look for, like obviously long legs and a long beak is something that's common. Is another thing that would kind of like maybe stand out, or something that would be where they would, I don't know, something that could identify maybe?
Well, to help identify shorebirds, your best bet is, well, a shorebird in general is pretty easy to recognize because of their shape. They tend to have long legs, a slender bill, bills of varying lengths. Some shorebirds have very, very long bills, some are short, stubby bills, but they all tend to be rather thin. Their method of feeding, their behavior, usually along the edge of the water, running along, either picking at the surface or actually probing their bill into the mud.
Okay. And is there something like, I don't know, maybe a book or something that somebody, are there specific books on shorebirds that people can read, and like where they can see pictures of them, or something where they kind of have an idea of what they're looking for if they actually physically went out and looked for these birds?
You can use any of the general bird field guides, have all the shorebirds in them. You can use those. There are books written specifically for shorebirds that go into a little more detail, and those are available as well. But the best way to go is to go out in the field and study the 3 or 4 species that you're likely to see often. And get very familiar with those.
Find those first.
Find those
kind of
first.
Work your way out from there.
Become familiar with them, and then if something new appears, it'll be obvious that it's something different, and then you can look that up.
Okay. And are there like specific, like an area around here that's a little bit closer, where they could go and see them? Obviously, the coast is someplace close. You'll
get your best diversity at the coast, but there are inland places. Anywhere where there's water, basically. You can walk along the Willamette River or the Columbia River here in Portland. You can go out to Forest Grove, Fernhill Wetlands, Jackson Bottom in Hillsboro, Smith and Bybee Wetlands in northeast Portland, or northwest Portland, rather.
Great. Well, I'm excited to see some shorebirds, so we're going to have a video, and you can tell us where this video is going to be at.
Yes, this is a trip we took out to both Fernhill Wetlands in Forest Grove and Jackson Bottoms in Hillsboro.
Great.
So this morning we're at Fernhill Wetlands, just south of Forest Grove. Fernhill is a great place to look for shorebirds in the late summer, early fall. We have a lot of birds passing through this time of year, and we have some resident shorebirds as well. The songs you hear in the distance are killdeer, very common plover that you can find in muddy areas around wetlands, sometimes in soccer fields. They're pretty much ubiquitous shorebird in the Willamette Valley. We're looking at a spotted sandpiper. During the breeding season, they have little dark spots all over their breasts. They lose that in the fall. The bird we're looking at now looks like a young bird, hatchier bird. Spotted sandpipers are easy to recognize at a distance because they're constantly bobbing their tails. They do this little dance as they walk along. Their tails are always bobbing up and down. So we're looking east into the mitigation marsh area of Fernhill Wetlands. The water's a little high right now. Water levels fluctuate here a lot, and that's what's so good for the shorebird habitat. Shorebirds like fresh mud to find aquatic invertebrates to eat. So they're probing around in the mud or picking things off the surface. Killdeer, one of the more common species that you'll see, are easy to recognize. They're a mud brown on the back, white breast with 2 black stripes going across their breast. So very easy to tell from a distance. Also on the mudflat, we have a semi-palmated plover, which is very similar to a killdeer, but about half the size, and only has one black band across the breast. And in the little patch of greenery there, we have a Wilson snipe. Snipe have very long, straight bills. They're a rich brown color with stripes on their face and blonde stripes going down their back. So if you remember that snipes have stripes, it's a little easier to identify. You'll notice a sign that says Wetlands Mitigation Area. The mitigation process allows developers, if their building is adversely affecting a wetland habitat, they can instead enhance wetland habitat elsewhere, so there's no net loss. So a mitigation bank just is enhanced wetlands to make up for wetlands that have been lost elsewhere. This body of water is known as Cattail Pond. It used to be covered in cattails, but a few years ago they died out. Now it's open water. The water levels fluctuate during the year. In the wintertime, it's fairly full. You'll have lots of waterfowl here. In the late summer, the water levels drop, and when you start seeing a lot of mud around the edges, then you'll start finding shorebirds here. Out in the middle of the wetland here, we have a small flock of small sandpipers, often referred to as peeps. Two species, least sandpiper and western sandpiper. They're both about the size of a sparrow, very small. So when they're distant, they can be a challenge to identify. Things to look for in the least sandpiper, that's our smallest sandpiper. Their bills are very short, very finely tipped, and they tend to feed in between their feet. They don't reach forward very far because their bills are so small. Western sandpipers have a longer bill, and they tend to lean straight forward when they feed. So if they're reaching forward and in deeper water, chances are they're westerns. If they're in shallower water, kind of picking between their toes, that's a least sandpiper. We're here at Jackson Bottoms Wetland Preserve, just off of Highway 213 at the south edge of Hillsboro. It's a Clean Water Services site. It has a visitor center. It's open all year. You can walk around the wetlands. Birding is great in the wintertime with waterfowl. This time of year, when the water levels are low, we're looking for shorebirds. Cattail Pond is pretty much dried up completely now. We also walked along Bobcat Marsh, which has some shallow water and some good birds right now. The bird closest to shore that we're looking at is a long-billed dowitcher. You can recognize dowitchers by their long, straight bill. This time of year they have a rich brown color. In the winter they fade to gray. But their feeding behavior is very distinctive. They'll walk along and probe their bills straight up and down into the mud, like an old sewing machine. There are two species of dowitcher in Oregon. Long-billed is the most common on inland sites. If you get to the coast, then short-billed dowitcher is a little more common. There are subtle differences between the two. You can't go by bill length alone. If you look just beyond the Dowitcher into the middle of the pond, there's a greater Yellowlegs. Yellowlegs get their name, of course, from bright yellow legs, very tall legs. And the greater Yellowlegs has a longer bill than the lesser Yellowlegs, which we also get here. On the near shore, just next to the killdeer, is a least sandpiper. Again, least sandpipers are our smallest sandpiper, about the size of a sparrow. When you get close enough, you can see they have yellow legs, which helps distinguish them from some of the other small sandpipers, which have black legs. But you have to be very close to see the leg color. Again, the thing to look for in a least sandpiper is the size and shape of the bill. They have very short, finely tipped bills, and they tend to feed by picking on the ground just beneath their feet, right in between their toes.
That's a great video. A few things that I noticed just from observing them, because I don't know that I've really gone out and actually looked at shorebirds before, to be honest. They seem small in size.
Most of them are quite small. As I say, sparrow-sized, robin-sized. Some of the very largest ones are maybe 18 inches long, but in general, they tend to be quite small.
Okay, and they also, when they take off, they seem like they're fairly fast. When they go a long distance, do they keep up a pretty good pace? Or
they keep up a very good speed when they fly. They're very aerodynamically designed. They have long pointed wings, so they don't have to beat their wings very much. They just kind of flutter their wingtips, and that propels them quite well.
So they glide quite nicely. That's amazing. And the noises that they're making, are they like communicating with each other, or are they just, I mean, how does that?
You'll often hear birds making vocal contact when they're in flight. Sometimes, especially birds that migrate at night, if you go out, you'll hear things chirping in the distance, and that's just to keep track of each other in the darkness. When they're feeding, you'll hear little chips and chirps, basically just keeping in contact with each other. There's safety in numbers. You don't want to get stranded by yourself all of a sudden.
Right, right. And when they're in the mud, are they looking for, are they getting bugs that are like on the top of the water that I saw? Are they like getting worms or something? Or what exactly are they? I mean, obviously they're feeding of some sort.
Right.
So
that depends on the species. Some will actually pick insects off the surface. Some with longer bills will actually probe deep into the mud, and the tip of their bill is flexible. They can actually move that and grab things under the surface of the mud to pull them out.
Oh, wow. And what about breeding? Do there certain times of year that they breed more than others, and do they have a place where they nest and they kind of lay low for a little while, or do they?
A lot of the shorebirds will breed in the Arctic, so early summer. So they'll spend the winter in South America, fly all the way up to the Arctic, spend a few weeks there nesting, and then fly right back home again.
And will they wait for everything to hatch and stuff, and everybody comes back home, or do they go up there and they leave them, and then they hatch over the time, like at a time frame that I don't know what it would take?
They migrate in stages. Once the young are out of the nest, the adults tend to take off and head south, and the young stay on the breeding grounds for a few more weeks. So during autumn migration, you'll have adults coming through starting in July and through August. Starting about late August, you'll start seeing some juveniles mixed in, and by the end of the migration, it's mostly juvenile birds that are coming through.
But not necessarily with their parents or
Right.
whoever was there, so
Right.
they just kind of get them situated, and they go, and then the next
go.
group comes in and kind of
Exactly.
takes over, and so they mix up each other. Okay. And what's the best way to kind of tell them apart? I mean, some are tall and some are small. Obviously, their beak and their color, but they all sort of look fairly similar to me.
A lot of them
I mean,
look
it
very
seems
similar.
like it would be hard for me to be able to just
Yes.
go and say, oh, that's a specific kind.
Yeah, as I say, the quickest way to learn any group of birds is to pick a few that you see a lot of and study those birds. The most important thing on shorebirds, if you're not quite sure what you're looking at, is to look at the general size and shape. Shorebirds have different bill lengths, different leg lengths, different proportions. So while the coloring can be very similar on different species, their shape is usually very distinctive. So once you've seen them a few thousand times,
Right.
you get familiar with them, and you can recognize them by shape and behaviors, the different feeding styles.
Right. And are they not aggressive towards other kinds of shorebirds? Or they all pretty much get along, or they don't have
They
any?
tend to get along pretty well because each species has their own way of feeding, so they're not in direct competition for food. Some are picking things off the surface, some are probing very deeply into the mud,
Getting
some are up in
different
the
areas
grass,
of
some
it.
are down in deeper water. So they can you can get a lot of different birds feeding in the same habitat.
Right, because they're all going for different things, so there's
Exactly.
not really any kind of competition in there. And when they nest or they breed, how many do they, are there lots of birds that they breed at a time, or do they just lay only a certain amount of eggs, or?
They lay generally small numbers, 3 or 4
Okay,
eggs
so
per
they're
clutch.
not,
Yeah,
it's not like
they're not making, not like quail are making a huge clutch. It's fairly small numbers. And they fly to the Arctic to breed because during the short summer of the Arctic, there's so much food available. You have a year's worth of insects coming out within just a few weeks.
So the chances of them living and surviving after they've hatched and stuff is way greater
there's lots
up there
of food
than
there,
it
and
would
there's
be
lots
down
of
here.
space. If you think of the shape of the continents, as you go further north, North America gets wider, so there's just more room. If the birds went south, South America gets skinnier as you go further south. There's just more space and more food available in the Arctic for breeding.
Well, that makes sense. So locations, if we were to, if I wanted to take the kids up and I wanted to go someplace to, go and watch them, we'll go further first before we go a little bit closer. So if we want to go further someplace to see them, what's a good time of year to go, a good location, and what should they bring? Should they have a book with them that kind of gives them an idea, or binoculars or something, or are they going to get close enough?
Some sort of visual aid is good. Binoculars or a spotting scope are very helpful because a lot of shorebirds are not that hard to identify, but they're difficult to get a good look at because they tend to be out on the mud flats. It's hard to get close to a lot.
Further away from you.
So if you can find areas where the mud is fairly close, some places along the coast you can get fairly close to birds. Some places like Fernhill Wetlands that have little observation decks right at the edge of the pond.
So you can kind of get out there and see them. And then up in Washington, there's a festival.
In the spring, up in Grays Harbor, there's a Shorebird festival every year. The spring migration is very concentrated. All the birds are kind of moving up at once. So you'll have thousands upon thousands of birds staging in Grays Harbor, building up a little more fat before they head their final length up to the Arctic.
So you can kind of see them kind of getting ready for their long trip.
In the autumn, the birds tend to kind of trickle south. They're not in the huge flocks that they are in the spring. It's spread out from about the 1st of July through the end of October. So you don't see the huge concentrations of birds in the fall, but you just have a kind of a constant trickle of birds coming south.
Okay, so the best time to go up there and watch if you want to see them in large numbers between
large
like
numbers
April
would be
and
spring,
May.
right?
Okay.
End of April is the best time.
Okay, and then here locally on the video you mentioned a couple places that are close, but still, like if they're out just in a field where they can see, like I don't know if necessarily a mud puddle is definitely the word to say it, but a small wetland or an area like that, they would definitely be able to see them.
During migration, you can see all sorts of things. There are some resident birds, like the killdeer that we saw so many of in the video. They're here all year, so you can always see them.
Oh, okay, great. We're going to watch another video, and I'll let you introduce the next one that we're going to be watching.
All right. The next video is some footage from Ridgefield Refuge up in Washington.
Okay. Great, thank you.
We're looking at long-billed Dowitchers here. You can see those long, straight bills, and when they feed, they just kind of go straight up and down into the mud like a sewing machine. They're rather plump shorebirds. They tend to have a bit of a hunchback shape when they're feeding. But they're probing that bill all the way down into the mud, getting their faces in the water.
Do they tend to feed more at dusk?
They'll feed pretty much any time. If you're on the coast, they're rather dependent on the tide. Sometimes the tide will come in and cover up the mud, so they'll just rest for a while, wait for the tide to go back out. Inland, they could feed pretty much any time.
Anytime, okay. And their wingspan, that one that just flew in, looked fairly good-sized wingspan.
They have long, slender wings. Again, for long-distance migration, you want long, skinny wings.
Is that species all probably similar to the same birds all right there, or there's a
All we've
couple
seen
different
there,
of them?
yeah, we're seeing long-billed Dowitchers mostly. You can hear the killdeer in the distance, that high pitch. Now there's a greater Yellowlegs. And he's wading in pretty deep because his legs are so long, but they have very long legs, and they're very bright yellow, so they stand out from a good distance. and a medium-long straight bill. There's another species called lesser yellowlegs, which looks identical as far as color goes, but it's about 2/3 of that size, and the bill's a little shorter. That's a grader.
And this location's up in Ridgefield, Washington?
Yes. It's a wonderful wildlife refuge there. There's an auto tour, so you can just drive the loop and see a lot of birds from your car. And that's another way to get close to birds. You can
That's
use the
great.
car as a blind. There's a killdeer with those 2 dark breast bands. Moving a little out of state now, of course, in Utah. But there are 2 species of shorebirds which you can find fairly commonly in eastern Oregon. We're rather lucky to get them here in the Willamette Valley occasionally. But that white bird with the kind of a tan head is a avocet. And their bills are actually upturned a little bit. They have very, very long legs,
He seems very tall.
very tall and lanky. And if you get a close look, you'll see the bill is actually upturned.
At the tip of it or the whole?
Pretty much the whole bill. It kind of bends upward.
Does it help it get food easier?
Yeah, they'll actually kind of brush their bills back and forth through the water and try to snag food.
Kind of
as they
skim the
go.
top of it.
Right.
Got it.
The little bird in the background, the black and white bird, that's a black-necked stilt. Little shorter, straighter bill than the avocet and ridiculously long legs. And the legs are bright pink. Hopefully we'll get a closer look at those.
So you've got the ones with the yellow legs and then ones with pink legs.
All right. The avocet has more grayish legs. Very vocal in the breeding grounds, as you can tell.
They're talking to each other.
They are.
Yeah, those are really long legs and a little one in the back. And
Right.
they're so small. They're just such small
Right, they're very
birds.
petite birds, but they have very, very long legs. And again, that just enables them to wade deeper to look for food. So they can take advantage of different habitats.
Well, those are some really great videos. I learned something new, and the shorebirds are. That's great that there's so many around here and so many places to go. So
Right.
that really makes a difference.
Right.
But thank you so much for coming out and talking to us about this, and thank you everyone for watching the show. We will be on here next time.